Hi everyone, welcome back for week 7. We are getting close to the end of this semester and we are still focusing on the ways in which museums convey messages to visitors, but this time we're focusing more specifically on the visitor themselves and what museums should be doing for visitors. And we generally would say that these days, the museum focuses much more on the visitor and the visitor experience than they did in the past. So we are interested and should be concerned with how visitors interact with exhibits and museums, generally speaking, and what we feel like museums should be doing for visitors beyond providing information. So you're going to have, again, 2 readings this week. One is the last section from Alexander and Alexander on this kind of 3-chapter series of ways in which these messages are conveyed to visitors, and then a chapter from A Companion to Museum Studies that specifically talks about interactivity. The main thing that we're concerned about is what we feel like exhibits and museums should be doing, right? And this is generally, but it's also a question for you specifically as you work on this final project, right? Do you want this solely to be entertaining? Do you want this to be a way for people to learn about a particular topic? And we've talked a lot about finding a balance between those 2 things, right? So we're fairly aware of those aspects of an exhibit, but we're also concerned about what this does for audiences. If we have certain exhibits that we feel like are geared towards creating conversation between 2 different groups of people, or maybe more groups than that, on a hot button issue. Are you hoping that your exhibit is going to give voice to a particular group of people who we don't necessarily hear from very often? Is it a black mark on our larger community's past in which justice should be served for a particular group of people? You can have a combination of these things present in your exhibit, but one of the things that I really want you to think about this week and when you're planning this final project is what exactly the visitor is supposed to get out of this exhibit beyond just learning something new, right? So we talked about approach. Put yourself in the mindset of the visitor, both as an individual and as a member of a community. So I'm going to briefly talk about what I mean when I'm talking about these things, and you should see these general ideas reflected in the readings for this week. So the Alexander and Alexander reading the chapter is titled To Serve, and is talking about serving communities generally speaking. And the direct quote from the chapter says, cementing the museum solidly within communities. Museums don't operate separately from the communities in which they're built, right? They're part of those communities. They may, generally speaking, serve a national audience or sometimes an international audience, but a lot of museums are also concerned with the people who are right in their backyard, right? The people who are more likely to return to the museum and keep the museum afloat, support it, give donations to it, become members. And for those reasons, museums see their position as being very much embedded in the community these days. It's also true that because of the development of historical analysis and the role that museums serve as service-based institutions, usually having control over preserving and displaying objects that are historically significant to the entire region, right, or nation, then they do feel like that this is a key component of the work that they do, right? So the museum is no longer just this temple, right? But it's a forum for engaging ideas, and there's real reasons behind why the museum has made this shift, both practical and more theory-based reasons behind that sort of development. So a good way to look at how museums tend to serve communities today is to go back and look at the example of the museum you visited, or think about other museums that you visited in the past and see the other things that they offer, because museums tend to offer many, many different things aside from just exhibits on a day-to-day basis these days. Even if they're very small institutions, they may do talks or historic home walks or film series. There's a really, really wide variety of things that that museums do for communities. And oftentimes museums are trying to directly address issues or embrace community features that they feel like are really going to help and address the concerns of the community or the community's needs on a day-to-day basis. So they can be, something as straightforward as providing, say, after school care to the neighborhood surrounding their particular institution. But we can also have more celebratory sort of events, like we can see here from the Desert Botanical Garden here in Phoenix, right? They do this every year event at night where they, have all of these luminarias around the gardens, and people get to go and enjoy the sunset and some music as they stroll through the gardens. And they present this, right, in the way that it's framed is it's a Southwestern thing to do, right? So conveniently, it makes the institution money, right? Another way for them to make money than just people walking in the door every day. But they definitely place it in the community itself, and they came up with this program that represents Phoenix or the Southwest as a region, and that's been a very popular program for them. So when you think about your own exhibit, do think about how you feel like this particular exhibit could serve a potential community, right? It could be people who worked in the realm of whatever sort of innovation you're involved in, or were otherwise affected, right? The general American population could be your community. And this is not to say that I'll dock you if you don't have some really solid sort of community-based initiative in mind. But this is getting us to think about why we're actually doing these exhibits and putting us in the position of doing public history work, which is working with the public and working with communities, and not necessarily elevating ourselves to a position above and basically telling people the ways in which they should think, right? It should be more of a back and forth sort of relationship. The second article that you're going to read is going to specifically talk about interactivity, which is another topic that we've talked a lot about this semester. Especially science centers are very, very interactive museum spaces. The question that the article is going to ask you is, what does it actually mean to say that an exhibit is interactive? Because there is more than one method of interactivity. So there's going to be a little list in there of different types of interactivity as defined by Whitcomb. But at the end of the day, this does closely relate to the Alexander and Alexander article or chapter, in the sense that essentially Whitcomb's arguing that interactivity at its best will shape spaces of dialogue, make museum spaces of dialogue across all of these different types of experiences of the diversity of visitors that come into a museum exhibit, right? So if you're trying to do this, as public historians should, right, make sure that it's actually engaging with the community and the diversity of peoples and experiences that come into the community. You want to really critically evaluate how you're choosing to be interactive in your exhibit, not just, oh, it's a cool idea because you get to touch a button, right, or pull a lever. It has some sort of meaning behind why you want somebody to push the button. What does that make them feel? How does it help them understand this process better than just reading it, right? And so in this example from the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, right, the Holocaust exhibit, it's a really sort of provocative, interactive experience, right, because it's asking you to make a decision in which you have to make a decision to walk through the doors to the next part of the exhibit, heavily tied to all of the knowledge that we already bring into the exhibit about the Holocaust, right? So definitely that will engender some sort of emotion when you go through this process, right? Even if it eventually brings you out into the same location and it's not real, right? Quote unquote. But it definitely, you could agree or disagree with this approach, but it definitely is going to, has had a lot of thought behind it in terms of helping people understand what this period in time felt like, beyond just reading about it in a textbook. So the other thing that you're going to do this week is you're going to peer review a rough draft. I am hoping by the time you watch this video that Canvas will work with us and actually give you the rough draft. So you should get a rough draft from another student through Canvas. If you don't, send me an email. And from there, you want to review that rough draft. Once you review the rough draft, you're going to submit it to me so that I can make sure that you did it and review it to give you a grade, right, as the reviewer. But some general rules on how I would like you to go about doing the rough draft. Just do it short answer style. It doesn't have to be formal in any way. This is just to be helpful to your fellow student and making sure that they have a good project at the end of the day. Don't worry about grammar or spelling or any of those types of things. Just focus on the big ideas that are present in the rough draft. There are questions for you to follow in the assignment for the rough draft. So the main things you want to focus on is, where do you feel like this exhibit is strongest? And where do you feel like there are some weak points, especially in argument or method in the exhibit, right? So this can be based on historical context, or it can be based on museum studies sort of analysis. Don't necessarily get into you're wrong or you're right sort of language, but more where are you strongest and where could you use some work, right? Make it constructive. And then also, right, end on asking some general questions that helps the person think about where they should go next, right? Things that if you were going through this exhibit, what would you still be wondering, for example? Or where do you feel like you would have liked more clarification, or you would have liked them to continue down this certain path that maybe they didn't go down as far as you would have liked. So that's generally the way I would like you to approach this. It's a fairly straightforward, easy assignment to do. Just, put effort into the peer review in the way that you would like somebody to peer review your work. And we should end up with some pretty good feedback at the end of the day. I will see you next week for our final week, week 8.